Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 10 of Series 8. The question for today is the phenomenon of reflective consciousness self-evident or self-obfuscating? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 1, Section 3. Last week we examined a number of ways that mind or consciousness has been neglected and overlooked. Today we are discussing why consciousness has been neglected and overlooked. There are two aspects to this question, in which one aspect helps to answer the other. That is, the neglect of consciousness in theories about and events in the world depend upon self-consciousness. That is, we need to appreciate the fact of our own self-consciousness in order to appreciate it in general. So we now need to focus on the neglect of our own consciousness, and we need to understand why there is a propensity towards this neglect. But the fact of this neglect or self-obfuscation is unexpected, because we are ourselves conscious beings. So we must ask again, how could we overlook the most significant feature of our existence? That is, Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" is an indubitable endorsement of our own self-consciousness. But the cogito is only indicative of the certainty of consciousness. It's also indicative of a late discovery and neglect of this supposedly obvious fact. And it's extraordinary that this explicit statement of mind was only given in the 17th century. Moreover, Paul Ricoeur challenges the cogito as a presumed certainty which can be deceived about itself. Merleau-Ponty writes that it is of the essence of consciousness to forget its own phenomena, and Husserl and Sartre have also noted the difficulty of apprehending consciousness. This ambivalence and neglect of consciousness is interestingly illuminated by a distinction made by Barry Dainton. Dainton makes a distinction between the phenomenal self and the psychological self. The phenomenal self is one's personal identity in which one apprehends oneself as oneself. The psychological self consists of all one's beliefs, values, memories and perceptions. To illustrate this distinction, Dainton makes use of the fictional idea of teleportation, as in Star Trek. In these scenarios, people are changed into data and teleported somewhere else. They are reconstructed exactly as before, down to every neuron and memory. They believe themselves to be the same person as before, that is, their psychological self. But the question is, are they the same person? They think they are the same person because they have the memories of the same person. But Dainton considers the view that teleportation is a form of suicide. This is because the phenomenal self would not have the same phenomenal identity as the previous person. This thought experiment distinguishes the phenomenal self from the psychological self. But the phenomenal self is usually overlooked in fictional considerations of teleportation. And this shows how crucial aspects of consciousness have been neglected and overlooked. I will eventually conclude with phenomenological and inherently structural reasons for the neglect of consciousness. But I first want to explore several other reasons why consciousness has been neglected and overlooked. One of these is the view that consciousness doesn't really exist, as it's only an abstraction with a notional existence. We have discussed this view before in an argument for physicalism that I rejected. But there is another version of the argument that holds that there is no pure consciousness. My response to this argument is to agree, and to go on to define what mind or consciousness is. John Searle provisionally defines consciousness as basically all those states that we are conscious of. Yet we can take this definition further to define the word consciousness as a collective noun. That is, it is a collection of different states like cognition, affect, volition and value. Yet these states are held together by my personal identity focused on a brain and body in a continuous timeline. That is, I don't have perceptions here, feelings over there and values somewhere else. All these states are tied together as an amalgam that I call myself. And that consciousness is an integrative concept which enables me to apprehend myself. I accept the divisibility of mind, but not as an argument against consciousness. And further to both the questions of the neglect and the divisibility of mind and consciousness are often used interchangeably and without distinction until recent times. But now the more general concept of mind includes every aspect of mental life, such as the unconscious, animals, etc. But as above, consciousness comprises of everything that I am conscious of, like pains, thoughts and wishes. Psychology might also be thought as a study of mind, whereas phenomenology is a study of consciousness. And in these studies, my approach is predominantly phenomenological rather than psychological. Although in order to demonstrate the neglect of mind, I will also adopt psychological approaches. And with respect to defining mind or consciousness, I myself hold an interactionist theory of mind and a structural conception of consciousness as a relation and process. I previously explained that view in detail and won't be doing so again today. Before exploring the inherent reasons for the neglect of consciousness, we should outline some more mundane reasons. Among these are genetic and psychological conditions such as autism, also described as mind blindness. One book on such is entitled The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. Yet firstly, there's also a materialist bias in scientific and analytic methods in understanding the mind as the brain. Scientific objectivity has endeavoured to remove the observing consciousness from its analyses. This is a standard criticism that phenomenology makes of science. Secondly, consciousness is invisible. That is, we look through it to observe the objects in the world that we need to deal with. And we have a familiarity with those objects that we don't have in the same way with consciousness. Thirdly, for these reasons, there's a lack of ideas and language to conceptualize and discuss the mind and mental states. Without words and concepts, topics become invisible, even for physical phenomena. For example, like consciousness, we can be oblivious to the air we breathe and live in. Only when some clever Greek immersed an upturned cup in water and asked what stops the water going in was there a realization that something was there, air. Fourthly, a large part of the mind is unobservable in the form of the preconscious and the unconscious. Explicit awareness of the structures and mechanisms of mind would also be counter to productive in life. That is, genetics, the unconscious and structures of consciousness are all guiding human behaviour. If these were always in the forefront of consciousness, unencumbered thought or action would be impossible. So for practical, evolutionary reasons, these structures must remain hidden together with the unconscious. Yet there's another reason why the unconscious obscures our perception of consciousness. And it's not simply because the unconscious is unconscious and because it's the largest part of our mind. It is because the unconscious supplants consciousness as a hidden source of action. In this sense, is as the origin of action, the unconscious makes consciousness redundant. For example, when we speak, words appear mysteriously out of our mouths without being in our consciousness first. So how are these words produced? Is it that the gods are speaking through us? It's rather that the concept of the unconscious makes such events comprehensible. And we don't need consciousness or reflective consciousness to explain them. And it's not just speech that can be explained in this way, but behavior. Freud coined the metaphor of the horse and the rider when he wrote about the id, ego, and the superego. The rider is the conscious ego trying to control the more powerful unconscious id. But of course, there is a rider that acknowledges the control of conscious thought in deliberation and choice. The question then is about the skill of the rider in understanding and channeling his powerful steed. Yet I've run through these explanations very quickly to get to the phenomenological explanations that interest me. These are structures inherent to consciousness that explain its own self-obfuscation. And understanding these is part of determining how and what we do in our lives. As part of this view, in order to apprehend anything, we need first-hand experience in order to comprehend it. For example, it's impossible to explain what a computer is to somebody who has never seen or used one. And there's a similar problem with the first-hand or immediate grasp of consciousness. And this immediate grasp of consciousness is a phenomenological concept. So I want to present a phenomenological account of this problem in terms of an error theory of consciousness. Error theory here denotes the pervasive yet neglected tendency of self-consciousness to forget itself. It tends to regress into pre-conscious, to overlook its attributes and even its own existence. If it's useful, this error theory of consciousness can be compared to John Mackey's error theory of value. Mackey argues that subjective values have been mistakenly projected onto objects as objective. Last week I also outlined Feuerbach's projection theory of religion in a similar way. But I want to make three structural arguments for the obscure and self-obfuscating character of consciousness. 1. The problem of the immersion of consciousness in its own transparent perceptions. 2. Regression is possible due to the graduation of mind in personal and evolutionary development. And 3. Attenuated cognition or non-referentiality due to the lack of contrasting background. I will first explain the self-obfuscation of consciousness by what we can call the immersion of consciousness in itself. That is, because consciousness is immersed in its own perceptions, it has difficulty in perceiving itself. As noted earlier, consciousness is transparent and sees through itself to observe the world. There are many examples and metaphors that illustrate this problem of immersion and oversight. For example, human consciousness is like a fish, unaware of the water that it swims in or is immersed in. Or again, the presence of air being overlooked until discovered with an upturned vessel in water. We also have the saying of not seeing the wood for trees. And we earlier mentioned the idea of the eye not being able to see itself. But of course the eye can see itself when a mirror is held up in front of it. And this is exactly what is going on with the capacity of reflective human consciousness. Yet there's still a need for a reflective capacity which raises the possibility of opacity or obfuscation. That is, how clean or dirty is the mirror that we are using to reflect our own consciousness. And one aspect of that mirror that we use in that reflective process is our ideas and concepts of ourselves. Chimpanzees may need a mirror, a physical mirror, to facilitate their awareness. Humans have access to ideas about themselves as well as theories of consciousness. Yet reflective consciousness also raises the possibility of reflecting on that reflective consciousness, and this can invoke an infinite regress, which can be a further impediment to clear self-consciousness. So self-consciousness is prone to overlook its own processes and perceptions in which it is immersed, and this transparency of the mechanisms which enable consciousness to be conscious leads to something else. It leads to a transparency in which consciousness forgets itself and even overlooks its own existence. But I presented the above idea of immersion largely by metaphor and illustration. Yet the idea of self-obfuscation can be explained explicitly with the help of structures of consciousness. That is, the notion of the graduation of consciousness enables it to regress as well as to develop. Graduation of mind or consciousness can be applied in two ways. One, to mental states. Two, to mind as a whole. Examples of graduation of mental states like belief, love and pain are relatively uncontentious. Yet the graduation of mind as a whole is less familiar and needs to be explained and argued. A case for the graduation of mind can be derived from species evolution and personal development. But the idea of graduation of consciousness of mind as a whole is contentious to some, but obvious to others. Graduation of mind is advocated by Darwin, Teilhard de Chardin, Jean Piaget, Bernard Williams, and others. And graduation is denied by John Locke, Descartes, Kant, Sartre, Colin McGinn, and Tim Bain. My basic argument for the graduation of mind is as follows. 1. Different creatures exist and individuals develop with different levels of mind. 2. These are manifestly different levels of mind or consciousness. And 3. There must be mental graduation in order to accommodate different levels of mind. Graduation of mind is, however, more contentious than graduation of mental states. Yet Bernard Williams rejects what he calls the all or nothing or ungraduated view of mind. And John Eccles speaks of progressive development of the biological evolution of consciousness. But as noted, several thinkers oppose a graduated view of mind. Sartre holds that it's impossible to conceive of consciousness to the degree to which it is not conscious of itself. This is contestable because consciousness can have less awareness of its own existence. For example, this is the case in chimpanzees and arguably in different degrees of human awareness. And the binary thinking opposed to this view is a misapplication of the principle of excluded middle. The excluded middle is an argument in logic that can be misapplied to minds or matter. The argument is that an item either exists or doesn't exist. It can't partially exist. I've argued the case for graduation in the case of consciousness more extensively elsewhere. So I now want to employ the idea of graduation to explain the difficulty of apprehending consciousness. My argument for obfuscation and self-obfuscation from regression proceeds in the following way. To begin with, consciousness expresses different characteristics at different levels. Pre-reflective or typically animal consciousness is not explicitly aware of its own existence. Human consciousness typically has such capacities as personal identity and is self-aware. But reflective consciousness isn't fixed or guaranteed by God or Sartrean claims of impossibility. It's a product of neurology and other factors like relations with the external world. It's subject to loss of capacities in weakness, sleep, senility, coma, and eventual cessation in death. This is because the relatively new and fragile capacity of self-awareness is subject to regression into earlier states. And earlier states of consciousness are animal and unconscious states that lack self-consciousness. Goethe describes this tendency to regress into more primitive states in the following way. Man cannot persist long in a conscious state. He must throw himself back into the unconscious, for his root lives there. Unquote. So my argument here is that consciousness is subject to graduation and thereby to regression. And in regression to more basic levels of consciousness, reflective consciousness can be obfuscated. That is, human beings tend to lose their reflective capacities and even overlook their own existence. Ordinary observation as well as phenomenology seems to support this view. A third way to explain the obfuscation of consciousness is due to what I call singular or non-referentiality. Singular or non-referentiality is a form of attenuated cognition or reduced or absent context. I previously used the term attenuated cognition to explain both moral fortitude and mysteriousness. Attenuated cognition produces mysteriousness due to a limited contrast or reference to context. Attenuated cognition and mysteriousness and the limited context of understanding is also produces self-obfuscation. Conversely, standard perception involves contrast and reference to a background of understanding. For example, a white spot on a whiteboard isn't a spot. It needs contrast in order to be seen. And again, Ferdinand de Saussure held that meaning is created by contrasts between different words. And Wittgenstein's cluster theory of meaning called for numerous complex interrelations. Saussure's contrasts and Wittgenstein's complex theory prevent a mistaken of the white spot idea. We aren't saying that a white spot or the colour white is just understood as a negation, as in non-white. That would mean the complex things like mathematics would be understood as non-mathematics. But that's not what is being claimed here. The claim is that complex objects like mathematics must be understood against complex backgrounds. Mathematics is a discipline, as sociology is, but both must be compared and contrasted against each other. And they must also be compared and contrasted to all other objects in the world that we know of. But self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. Self-consciousness is thereby limited to singular reference to itself and to no references or context. Physical objects can be understood in at least two ways. One, by comparison, and two, with other physical objects in the world. Motorbikes, for example, can be understood more deeply by comparisons with other motorbikes. But again, self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. That is, I have an immediate and a priori awareness of my own consciousness, but my awareness of other people's consciousness is intuitive, empirical, reasoned, and a posteriori. This paucity of reference available to self-consciousness produces self-obfuscation. That is, self-consciousness is inclined to overlook its own existence. Moreover, self-consciousness should not be able to exist in the absence of ulterior references, and consciousness should not be able to become self-conscious, but it does. And because self-consciousness does exist, we need a further non-referential account of meaning in order to explain it. So I have used the notions of immersion, regression, and singular reference as structural ways to explain obfuscation. But there are also a lot of conceptual, linguistic, and psychological ways of explaining obfuscation. But I'm not primarily interested in such contingent methods of explanation. Self-obfuscation is also significant because it tells us things about consciousness. It tells us, one, it tells us something about the character of consciousness. Two, its neglect suggests that something important has been overlooked. And three, consciousness opens the door to a new way of understanding, as Husserl insisted. My general point is to explicate the problem of the obfuscation of consciousness in an account that I call error theory. Error theory denotes the pervasive yet neglected tendency of self-consciousness to forget itself. It tends to regress into the preconscious, to overlook its attributes and even its own existence. In conclusion, I can reiterate my view of consciousness as a foundation and nexus of human subjectivity, and that the neglect of consciousness has repercussions throughout philosophy as well as human life. I firstly outlined a number of mundane reasons for the neglect of consciousness. These included language, religion, projection theory, and psychological conditions like autism. We also mentioned notional existence, transparency, familiarity with objects, and the unconscious. Some approaches and methods are also unappreciative of consciousness, such as analytic philosophy, physicalism, scientific objectivity, and behaviorism. I'm looking for phenomenological reasons for obfuscation, not linguistic, conceptual, social, or historical reasons. And I have several reasons for doing this. Two of them are that, one, a first-hand apprehension of consciousness explains both its neglect and its subsequent examination. And two, phenomenological structures are the most effective way of understanding consciousness. So I gave three features in explanation of the obscure and self-obfuscating character of consciousness. One, the immersion of consciousness in its own transparent perceptions. Two, regression due to the graduation of mind. And three, attenuated cognition or non-referentiality due to a lack of contrasting background. And in my view, the neglect of consciousness prevents the realization of consciousness as an integrative concept. That is, consciousness is the basis for understanding of the most vital dimension of human life. It is also a basis for asking the question, what can we do with the phenomenon of consciousness? And I answer this question in terms of value as a constituent of consciousness. That is, the pursuit of value as the will to value, leading to a sufficiency of value. So let me have your comments and criticisms on websites like meetup.com and philosophy of value workshops.